The first thing American intelligence saw was not an airplane. It was not a ship. It was something so enormous and so strangely shaped that the photographs seemed almost impossible to classify. Somewhere along the Caspian Sea, a Soviet machine nearly 100 meters long was moving across the water at a speed no conventional ship of its size should have been able to reach. It had wings. It had a boat-like hull, and somehow this giant was flying only a few meters above the surface. The analysts gave its predecessor a nickname that captured the confusion perfectly: the Caspian Sea monster. But the real shock came later, when the Soviets turned the idea into something even more dangerous. They built an Ekranoplan designed not to carry cargo, not to rescue sailors, but to hunt warships. It was called Lun, and mounted across its back were 6 enormous anti-ship missiles. But there is a problem with the famous claim behind this story. NATO did not literally spend 56 years building a copy of the Lun. There was no secret Western production line working for 5 decades to reproduce it. The truth is more interesting. For roughly half a century, Western engineers repeatedly returned to the same Soviet idea because they could never completely dismiss what it promised: an aircraft that could move like a plane, carry enormous loads like a ship, and skim across the ocean low enough to complicate conventional detection and interception. The Soviet Union had discovered something that looked almost absurd, and decades later, the United States was still asking whether the underlying idea could finally be made practical. That question begins in the strangest chapter of Cold War aviation. In the 1960s, Soviet engineer Rostislav Alexeyev was already obsessed with a problem that conventional aircraft and ships solved badly. Ships were efficient, but slow. Aircraft were fast, but expensive to operate and dependent on airfields. Alexeyev wanted something in between. His answer was the Ekranoplan, a wing-and-ground effect vehicle designed to fly extremely close to a surface. When a wing moves just above water, the airflow behaves differently. Lift increases, induced drag falls. The vehicle can support enormous weight while using less power than it would require to fly normally at altitude. The machine does not simply float, it generates aerodynamic lift, but it stays trapped in a narrow operating environment. Too high, and the special advantage disappears. Too low, and waves become a potentially catastrophic obstacle. That contradiction would follow the Soviet program for decades. Yet in the hands of Alexeyev's design bureau, the idea became something extraordinary. The experimental KM Ekranoplan emerged as one of the largest aircraft ever constructed. It was enormous, unconventional, and difficult for foreign intelligence services to understand from photographs alone. The Soviet Union was experimenting with a new category of machine, one that belonged to neither the traditional world of aviation nor naval warfare. And then the question changed. If something this large could move this fast across water, what could it do with weapons? The answer came with Project 903. Lun was conceived as a missile-carrying strike Ekranoplan, intended primarily for attacking surface ships. Its basic military logic was brutally simple. A conventional warship had to search for aircraft above the horizon and ships moving across the sea. Lun could approach at very low altitude while moving at aircraft-like speeds. Its target was not a patrol boat. The concept was aimed at high-value surface combatants, potentially including aircraft carriers. The Soviet Navy saw an opportunity to combine speed, range, heavy weapons, and the unique characteristics of ground-effect flight into a single platform. But creating that platform was not simply a matter of putting wings on a ship. The entire machine had to be designed around one strange rule. It had to live only a few meters above the water. That requirement produced one of the most bizarre-looking war machines of the Cold War. Lun had a broad, boat-like fuselage. Its wings stretched outward like those of a giant aircraft. At the front, multiple engines were mounted in a configuration that helped generate the enormous thrust required for takeoff. 8 Kuznetsov NK-87 turbofan engines powered the completed vehicle. Together, they produced the force necessary to push the roughly 380-ton machine forward and lift it onto the cushion of air created beneath its wings. The shape was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was functional. The machine looked like a flying ship because that was essentially what it was. Its hull allowed it to operate on water. Its wings generated lift. Its engines gave it the acceleration required to break free from the water's resistance. And once it settled into ground effect, the physics of the machine changed. Ground effect is easier to understand if you picture a paper airplane flying a few inches above a table. Near the surface, the air trapped beneath the wing cannot escape as easily. The wing effectively rides on a compressed layer of air. Lift increases while certain forms of drag decrease. The Soviet designers exploited this phenomenon on a gigantic scale. Lun did not need to climb to 10,000 meters. It did not need to fight for altitude. It wanted to remain down there, just above the waves. At cruising speed, the vehicle could reach roughly 340 miles per hour. That was the attraction. A conventional ship of similar mass could not come close. A conventional aircraft carrying an enormous naval weapon load did not have the same ability to operate directly from the sea. Lun occupied the strange territory between them, but speed alone did not make Lun frightening. The real weapon was sitting on its back. 6 launch tubes carried P-270 Mosket anti-ship missiles, mounted in 3 pairs along the upper fuselage. The Mosket was a powerful supersonic anti-ship weapon designed to attack major surface combatants. Suddenly, the enormous Ekranoplan was no longer an engineering experiment. It had become a potential missile carrier, capable of rushing toward a naval formation at extraordinary speed. The Soviet concept was based on a terrifying equation: find the enemy fleet, stay low, close the distance quickly, launch missiles, and use speed and the sea itself as protection. On paper, it offered a way to threaten some of the most valuable ships in the world without building another conventional aircraft carrier or cruiser. But paper was not the sea. The first completed Lun emerged from a Soviet industrial system that had already spent years experimenting with Ekranoplans. Development of the Project 903 design began in the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the concept evolving from the earlier KM program. Construction took place within the Soviet Union's specialized aviation and shipbuilding industry. The machine was eventually floated out in 1986. The only completed combat model, MD-160, entered service with the Soviet Navy's Caspian flotilla in 1987. And when the machine finally moved under its own power, the sight must have been almost surreal. Hundreds of tons of metal, 8 jet engines roaring, a wall of spray behind the hull, and then the entire structure lifting away from the water until the gigantic aircraft was skimming over the Caspian surface. The important detail was not simply that Lun could fly. It was that the Soviet Union had made something this large operate in ground effect while carrying a serious weapons load. That distinction mattered. The Cold War was filled with experimental aircraft, but very few were designed to transform the ocean itself into part of their flight envelope. The sea was no longer just the place beneath the machine. It was part of the machine's operating environment, and this was where Western analysts faced a problem. The Soviet Union had not invented ground effect. The phenomenon had been understood for decades. Aircraft designers in other countries had experimented with wing-in-ground effect concepts. The United States had its own research programs and prototypes, but the Soviets had pushed the concept much farther, especially in terms of scale and military ambition. They were not asking whether a small craft could skim above water. They were asking whether a massive weapons platform could do it reliably. That distinction explains why the phrase, "NATO tried to copy it," is both tempting and misleading. NATO was not one country with one engineering department. There was no single Western response that simply reproduced Lun. Instead, the Soviet Ekranoplans became part of a much broader technological question. Could ground effect vehicles offer a useful military advantage? Could they move troops and equipment faster than ships? Could they operate without conventional runways? Could they exploit the surface of the ocean to move enormous loads while avoiding some of the costs of conventional aviation? The West kept returning to those questions because the underlying physics never went away. But neither did the problems. Lun's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It was designed to fly close to the surface, and the ocean is not a runway. Waves move, weather changes, visibility disappears, navigation becomes critical. A machine traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, only a few meters above water, has little room for error. A conventional aircraft can climb over a storm system. A ship can slow down. A ground effect vehicle operating in its ideal regime has fewer options. It is powerful when conditions are favorable and increasingly complicated when they are not. Then there was another problem: flexibility. A destroyer could remain at sea for long periods. An aircraft could move inland. A submarine could disappear beneath the surface. Lun needed a carefully controlled environment. It was enormous, specialized, and expensive. Its operational infrastructure was not comparable to that of a normal aircraft. The Soviet military therefore faced a fundamental question: was the extraordinary capability worth building an entirely new logistical ecosystem around it? The answer gradually became less convincing. The Soviet military's interest in Ekranoplans had already fluctuated before Lun. In 1984, Soviet defense leadership removed ground effect vehicles from its list of priorities, and the unusual nature of the technology and its material requirements were among the difficulties. Lun continued through testing and eventually service, but the larger vision of a fleet of these machines never became reality. Plans called for multiple aircraft, yet only one Lun was completed. A second example reportedly reached a very advanced stage of construction before the Soviet system collapsed. Then history delivered the problem no engineer could solve. The Soviet Union disappeared. The enormous military-industrial system that had produced Lun was breaking apart. Funding collapsed. Priorities changed. The Cold War ended. The strategic environment that had made an anti-carrier Ekranoplan attractive was no longer the same. Lun was no longer the future of Soviet naval warfare. It became an orphan of a vanished military doctrine. The machine that had been designed to attack the world's most powerful fleets eventually sat unused, and that might have been the end of the story. Except the idea refused to die. For decades, engineers around the world continued studying ground effect vehicles. Some concepts focused on civilian transportation. Others explored military logistics. The Soviet experience became a reference point, a demonstration that the technology could be scaled far beyond conventional experimental aircraft. The lessons were not necessarily about copying Lun's exact shape. They were about understanding what worked, what failed, and why. This distinction became especially important in the United States. In the 21st century, American defense planners began revisiting the idea of enormous aircraft capable of operating from the sea. One of the most prominent modern concepts was DARPA's Liberty Lifter program, which explored a large ground effect aircraft intended primarily for military logistics. The mission was dramatically different from Lun's missile hunting role, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. Enormous payloads, ocean operations, and the use of ground effect to combine some advantages of ships and aircraft. Modern American engineers were not simply photocopying a Soviet machine. They were returning to a technological path that the Soviet Union had explored decades earlier. And that is where the 56 years becomes interesting. From the first flights of the giant Soviet KM in the 1960s to modern American efforts to reconsider ground effect transport, more than half a century passed. 56 years is a useful way to describe the span between the Cold War's giant Ekranoplan experiments and the modern revival of the concept. But it is not accurate to say NATO spent every one of those years trying to copy Lun. The real story is stranger. For more than 5 decades, Western and Soviet engineers kept circling the same unanswered question: could an aircraft that lives close to the sea become genuinely useful? The Soviet answer was ambitious. They built a missile carrier. The American answer, decades later, was more practical: Try using the same physics to move enormous quantities of equipment, and that difference reveals something important about military technology. Lun was not a failure because it was incapable of doing what it had been designed to do. In many respects, that was exactly the problem. It could do something extraordinary, but extraordinary capability is not the same thing as useful capability. The machine was fast, it was heavily armed, it exploited ground effect in a way few vehicles had ever attempted. But it was also specialized, dependent on favorable operating conditions, difficult to support, and tied to a strategic concept that disappeared with the Cold War. Only one completed Lun entered service. It never became the Soviet answer to the aircraft carrier. It never formed the giant strike fleet its designers once envisioned. And it never became the unstoppable sea monster that popular mythology sometimes suggests. Yet calling Lun a failure would miss the larger story. Because Lun proved something. It proved that a machine weighing hundreds of tons could use ground effect to move at aircraft-like speeds immediately above the ocean. It proved that an Ekranoplan could carry serious weapons. It proved that the boundary between aircraft and ship did not have to be absolute. And it also proved something more painful. Physics may allow a machine to exist long before economics, logistics, doctrine, and weather allow that machine to become practical. After the Soviet collapse, MD-160 was eventually left inactive. For years, it remained at Caspian, a gigantic relic of a military future that never arrived. In 2020, the preserved Lun was moved toward Derbent, where it became a monument to one of the most unusual experiments of the Cold War. The image is almost perfect. A machine designed to hunt aircraft carriers sits motionless on land. Its missiles are gone. Its engines are silent. The sea that once carried it at hundreds of miles per hour is no longer its battlefield. But the idea survives, and perhaps that is the real reason the Lun still matters. Military history is full of weapons that were technically brilliant, but strategically useless. There are tanks that were too complicated to maintain, aircraft that were too expensive to deploy, ships that arrived after the war they were designed for, and weapons that solved problems their armies no longer had. Lun belongs in that strange category. It was not a conventional airplane. It was not a conventional ship. It was not the future, but it was a glimpse of a different future, a future where oceans became runways, where enormous machines could move beneath the radar horizon, where a 6-missile strike platform could race across the sea faster than many warships could even dream of moving. And decades later, when American engineers began looking again at giant ground effect aircraft, they were not simply copying a Soviet monster. They were confronting the same unanswered question that had haunted Alexeyev's engineers from the beginning. Can the ocean become the world's largest runway? The Soviet Union answered that question with Lun. History answered it with caution. And the modern world is still testing the question. That may be the strangest legacy of the machine, once called the Caspian Sea monster. It did not conquer the ocean. It did not replace the aircraft carrier. It did not create a new era of naval warfare. Instead, it forced engineers to look at the boundary between air and sea and ask whether that boundary was real at all. For a few years, above the Caspian waves, the answer seemed to be no. A 380-ton war machine lifted itself onto a cushion of air. 8 engines screamed behind it. 6 missiles waited on its back, and the Soviet Navy possessed something almost no one else on Earth had. Then, the Cold War ended. The monster stopped moving. But the question it created never completely disappeared.